Here with me today is Senator Tom Cotton, one of the earliest figures to point out that the coronavirus pandemic may have originated from a Wuhan lab. Senator, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Margaret. It's good to be on with you.
So, like I was saying, you were one of the earliest figures to point out that the coronavirus might have originated from a Wuhan lab. Democrats, media, and fact checkers absolutely slammed you for this. We saw social media platforms absolutely banning any kind of discussion of this from their platforms. And yet now we see a complete 180 where the fact that coronavirus may have originated from a Wuhan lab is a very viable theory. Why do you think we saw this knee-jerk suppression, and what does that mean for our country more broadly?
Well, I think the reason you saw the knee-jerk reaction is because I said it. And the Democrats and the media, though I repeat myself, don't like my politics. And then Donald Trump repeated it as well. And obviously they thought the coronavirus was a way that they could finally defeat the president in the campaign. So that's a basic reason why you saw the left and the media react hysterically to what is a very common sense observation. So from the beginning, I just said, look, China has unleashed this plague on the world. It appears to be from a bat-based coronavirus. Maybe we should point out that this virus didn't originate like up in some remote mountain village next to a cave full of bats. It originated in a city that's larger than New York, right down the street from a lab where they research bat-based coronaviruses, a lab which is run by a woman whose nickname is literally the Bat Lady. Again, most Americans, I think, could look at those basic facts and say, yeah, we ought to at least look into it. And then over time, we've seen more and more evidence pointing towards the lab. Not direct evidence, not a smoking gun. Intelligence collection rarely works that way. But every bit of circumstantial evidence we have points to the lab. Bats generally aren't located inside of Wuhan. There are no bats being sold in that stupid food market the Chinese communists pointed to as the origin. The early studies of the virus in Wuhan said that many more people had contracted the virus without being in the food market than those who had been in the food market. And since then, we've learned more as well. We've learned, for instance, that some staff at those labs may have contracted coronavirus-like symptoms as early as the fall of 2019. And of course, the very fact that the Chinese Communist Party continues to conceal what was going on in that lab, continues to refuse to let a reputable team of international scientists into the lab and make available the staff and the scientists working there, all point directly towards the labs as the source of this virus. I believe that's the case. I don't know if we'll ever have direct smoking gun level evidence of it, but I also believe that China is responsible for unleashing this pandemic on the world because of how they lied about it from the very beginning and allowed what could have been a controllable local public health emergency into the worst pandemic in a century, and China ought to pay for its lies.
So like you were saying, we don't have direct smoking gun evidence, and maybe we can't unless we are able to examine what went on in the Wuhan lab ourselves. It doesn't seem like they're going to give us this information. What options does Biden have right now?
So I suspect most of the evidence about what was going on in that lab has been destroyed. I suspect most of the people who know what was happening in that lab have either disappeared into China's political prison camps or worse, been killed. One of the earliest doctors to blow the whistle on what was happening there had Chinese secret police show up at his home in the middle of the night at the end of 2019 to silence him. Tragically, he died a few weeks later from this very coronavirus. Now, it is always possible that there is someone who knows what happens there, maybe even someone who was able to maintain proof of what happened there, and that person might become a defector. That's always possible. But again, I don't think that further review of the evidence we have is going to conclusively establish the lab as the source of this virus. I think Joe Biden ordered this so-called 90-day review of that intelligence evidence, in part because he wanted to kick the can down the road, keep the focus on his multi-trillion-dollar taxing and spending bills, keep the focus on his first trip overseas to Europe, and then in mid-August, when people aren't paying much attention, kind of say, well, we've reviewed the evidence and it's still inconclusive, and hope that the media just goes along with that. We don't know the origins of it and we shouldn't overreact to that. I would say, again, we should still impose real punishment on China, because even if it did originate in that stupid food market, their refusal to tell the world about it, their refusal to announce what was happening in Wuhan, their pressuring of the World Health Organization to not declare a global pandemic, no doubt, without question, scientists around the world agree, made it much worse. That's why China needs to pay.
And so how should this impact the United States' relationship with China going forward?
Well, when you unleash a global plague, it doesn't help your relationship. But look, China for decades has been cheating and stealing and lying. And now when you add on to the fact that they unleashed this plague on the world, they need to be held accountable. There are some things we can do to hold them directly accountable, like we could open American courts up to legal action against the persons in China who are directly responsible for unleashing this pandemic. We did that for the 9/11 victims, for instance. But there are other things that we could do that, frankly, we should have probably done long ago to teach China some lessons for their decades of lying and cheating and stealing our jobs, like revoking their permanent most favored nation status. So the President and the Congress have to review that every year to decide whether China should get those beneficial trade preferences, or insisting that international financial institutions quit treating China like it's some developing third world economy and giving them sweetheart loan deals. We could also, for instance, crack down on visas to Chinese Communist Party officials and their family members who are coming to the United States, oftentimes on multi-year visas that just let them come and go, when Americans, especially American government officials, can hardly even get a visa to go into China to do their own job. There are a lot of things that we can do to impose real consequences on China, not just for this pandemic, but for what it's done to America for decades.
You know, throughout the pandemic, the media came after you not only for your quick response to the coronavirus pandemic, but also for this op-ed you wrote for the New York Times saying, "Send in the troops," calling for a military response to the rioting. I'm really curious to know what prompted you to publish that with the New York Times in the first place, and were you expecting the backlash that ensued?
Well, I could have come to any number of more right-of-center outlets, but I thought this is something that New York Times readers needed to hear, because both the news coverage and the editorializing of the rioting and the looting that was gripping the streets last summer painted a very distorted picture, as if it was just mostly peaceful protest. I think we can all remember CNN reporters standing in front of burning buildings telling the anchor back home, this is a mostly peaceful protest. So I wanted to publish it in a left-of-center mainstream organization. I didn't quite anticipate the level of controversy it would generate. I suspected it would generate some controversy. I've heard that they had more canceled subscriptions that day than any time in recent memory. And of course, the editor of the editorial page who published it ended up having to cancel himself. He got fired for publishing my op-ed, not before saying on the way out the door that it didn't meet the New York Times standard, even though they never cited a single fact that was wrong with it or a single argument. Now, I might agree that it didn't meet their standards. I far exceeded their normally very low standards. But I thought it was an important message for New York Times readers to hear, or for liberal elites in cities like Washington and New York to hear as well. Look, this country has a long history of respecting peaceful protest, political demonstrations, but we can have zero tolerance for the kind of rioting and looting and arson and really anarchy we saw in our streets last summer. There can be zero tolerance for that. And I think it's just a common sense measure to say, like, yes, obviously our local police and sheriff's offices have foremost and primary responsibility for restoring order in our streets. But there were some cases in which those local law enforcement officers were overwhelmed. The numbers were just too large. And in some cases, unfortunately, they weren't really allowed to do their job. And if that's the case, many governors called out the National Guard in their states to restore order. And of course, one final measure, something that happened during the riots in Los Angeles in 1991 or 1992, is to use the Insurrection Act, a law that's been on the books almost from the very beginning, to make sure that our citizens in a time of disorder can have order restored. Now, fortunately, that wasn't necessary last summer, but I think most Americans believe it's simple common sense that you cannot allow anarchy to reign in the streets.
Well, given how the media has treated these different issues we've been talking about, and then particularly Republicans throughout the pandemic like yourself, how is a Republican likely to succeed in a 2024 election?
Well, if we have a few more years of what we've seen in the first months of the Biden administration, I think we're going to have a big success in the 2022 midterms, but then also in 2024. I mean, the murder rate went up at the highest rate on recorded history last year, and it's probably going to be worse this year. The same is true of a lot of other violent crime. We have more illegal immigration at the border than we've had in a generation. And this to say nothing of inflation growing, and Biden and the Democrats in Washington wanted to pump trillions of dollars more in higher taxes and more spending into our economy. At the same time, they're slashing the defense budget, slashing enforcement for immigration. None of these are popular positions. I know, a handful of elite liberals on social media and in big cities have talked themselves into believing these are mainstream positions, but they are not. Not even some of those big cities, for instance. I mean, look what happened in the Democratic primary in New York City for mayor just last week. I mean, they elected, or they appear to have nominated, once their complicated, convoluted voting system is finally complete, a candidate who is a former police officer and who campaigned as a candidate who is willing to get tough on crime in New York, contrary to all of the far left progressives who were running as mayor on defunding the police. So even among a lot of their own voters, the Democrats are proposing policies that are far outside the mainstream and that are going to have dire consequences for our country. And therefore, I think a lot of voters are going to be ready to hold them accountable in 2022 and then 2024.
Right. Well, we're here in Iowa today. We're even mixing with voters. You're at this event in South Dakota earlier today, and you're from this region of the country, but not from this state. How have you felt that you've been received?
I've had a great time today in both South Dakota and in Iowa. John Thune in South Dakota, Chuck Grassley in Iowa are both up for re-election next year. I'm here to both urge them to announce that they're running for re-election and to campaign with them. They're highly respected members of the U.S. Senate, and it's critical that we hold all the seats that we have in a 50-50 Senate so we can go out and win Democratic seats and make sure we take back the majority and pump the brakes once and for all on the Democrats' radical agenda. So it's always great to be back in Iowa, and I enjoyed my time in South Dakota as well. We had a great turnout. I can tell you Republicans in both of these states, just like Republicans in Arkansas, are ready to stop Joe Biden's radical agenda, and they're ready to win back both the House and the Senate next year.
Well, it's also been rumored that you're in a very good position to be considered a presidential candidate in 2024. What would you say to people who say that? And what would you say to those who say, look, there's a lot of Republican candidates lining up for 2024. How do they all compare? We have former President Donald Trump. We have Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. So big lineup here.
Yeah. Well, I would say it's too soon to speculate about an election that is 3 years away, especially when we have such a big election next year. Most Republicans with whom I visit, whether it's in my state of Arkansas, in Iowa today, in South Dakota, or across the country, really are concerned about the direction of this country under Joe Biden and the Democrats. They're worried about radical tax and spend plans. They're worried about the crime wave we see, about a border that's totally open at a time when we're gutting law enforcement funding and funding for our military. So they want us to stop that, and they want us to focus on stopping that right now. Then they want to focus, and they want us to focus on winning back the House and the Senate next year. That's one reason why I'm making this Midwest swing to help out my colleagues in the Senate. I'll be doing this across the country. Once we get through primaries next year, I'll be campaigning the states where we have nominees that are trying to either hold the seats where some of our senators are retiring or pick up seats that are currently held by Democrats.
And what would you say sets you apart from other Republican candidates who are speaking out so broadly right now?
Well, I'll let the political pundits judge what sets all of us apart. I think, one thing that I've always tried to do from the time I got into politics is to protect our country and to protect Americans and everything they hold dear. This is why I joined the Army as well, is to protect our country. Whether that's from rising crime, illegal immigration, foreign threats, whether it's China or terrorist organizations. And now Americans need protection from the radical liberal agenda as well, that wants to take more of their money and boss them around using unelected bureaucracies in Washington, indoctrinate their kids against their wishes, oftentimes to hate their country. That is a message I've delivered in Iowa and South Dakota today, on which I've campaigned in Arkansas now 3 times, and which I'll be taking all across the country. And I think many Americans expect their elected leaders to protect them, to keep them safe, give them a fair shot at having a successful life, and ensuring that they control their lives, not being controlled by some unelected bureaucrats in a remote capital.
We've seen biological males in women's sports, transgender surgeries for minors, critical race theory. Culture wars are just kind of exploding in these first couple months of the Biden administration. We covered last week an internal memo from the Republican Study Committee urging Republicans to lean into the culture war and to really lean into critical race theory because it's a winning issue for Republicans. Would you agree with that? Is it a winning issue for Republicans?
Well, I would say that Republicans didn't start a culture war. The liberals have been waging a culture war on normal Americans for a very long time now, and it's well past time for all Republicans to join it and fight it and win it. I mean, this goes back to the Obama administration, persecuting Catholic nuns, trying to force them to pay for birth control. 15 or 20 years before that, no Democrat would have supported something like it. But their party has become so radical on some of these issues that they are far beyond asking for toleration for different ways of life and different viewpoints, whether it's political or religious, far beyond asking for acceptance. They want to enforce celebration. They want to use the punitive power of the law and of the federal government to enforce their far left worldview. That is not popular. It's not even popular with a lot of their own voters, certainly with a lot of independents or Republicans. And so I think it's important that Republicans realize that normal Americans expect us to stand up and to fight back, oftentimes just in the name of common sense. Of course, you should not have boys competing in girls' sports. How is that fair to those girls? And of course, we should not teach our children the lie that America is somehow fundamentally flawed or systematically racist and that they should be ashamed to live in America. We should teach them they should be proud to live in the freest and the greatest country in our history. We should teach them times where we've failed to live up to our high ideals, but also teach them all the times when we made progress towards those ideals as well. These are very basic things, but a lot of liberal elites in Washington simply don't see that. I mean, they're caught in their own bubble. And they're trying to use the power of the federal government and law and regulation to enforce their worldview on a large majority of Americans who reject it root and branch.
Like you were saying, liberally, it's often dismissed the culture wars as perhaps more of a religious side of politics that are not as interesting. But now it seems like people are paying a lot more attention to the culture wars as they escalate. Do you think that Republicans should be leaning into the culture wars in this way?
Well, again, the Republicans aren't starting some kind of culture war. Republicans are simply trying to defend normal Americans from a war being waged on them by cultural elites. And there's some issues that have religious themes or touch upon diverse religious views, but there are other issues as well, like simply respecting our flag. There was an Olympic athlete a few days ago that turned her back on the flag at the medal stand after her event in the U.S. trials. Well, she wants to compete wearing the Stars and Stripes. She wants to compete with the Stars and Stripes hopefully being raised on the medal stand. I think it's the least that we can expect people to do is to actually honor the flag. Honor the flag that people her age are wearing on their uniform in our armed forces, defending her and our right to even do something like compete in the Olympics to begin with. So again, these issues touch on a lot of different currents in American society. But the one common thread is that you have a very small but very noisy and very influential liberal minority in Washington trying to enforce a monolithic worldview on a very large, diverse country that rejects it.
And this brings me to this upcoming Supreme Court case on abortion, which the court will take up in October, that advocates on both sides of the aisle are saying could potentially overturn Roe v. Wade. Do you think it has the ability to overturn Roe v. Wade? And what would that look like for our country?
Well, I don't know if that precise question is teed up in this case, but I do know that the law at issue in Mississippi should be upheld. And I'm disappointed that it was struck down to begin with. States like Mississippi, states like mine, have the power under our constitutional system to adopt reasonable regulations on a practice like abortion to protect the unborn life of the baby, to protect the health of the mother as well. For far too long, the Supreme Court has had its own special abortion jurisprudence that really doesn't apply in any other field of law, treating this one practice as somehow constitutionally sacrosanct, when in fact, Roe v. Wade, Planned Parenthood v. Casey, didn't just get it wrong in its own terms, they've been proven wrong as time has progressed, and we've pushed the frontiers of medical science back. So young babies born at 26, 25, 24, 23 weeks can survive outside the mother's womb. So it's high time for the Supreme Court to revisit this issue.
And we see different polling on this all the time. Abortion advocates like to say that all Americans support unrestricted abortion, but we even saw last week in a poll from the Associated Press that most Americans want restrictions on abortion after 12 weeks. Now, a lot of Americans still support abortion up until 12 weeks. Do you think America can handle our country if Roe v. Wade is overturned? Do you think America can handle that?
So I think not only can America handle it, that's the best way for us to handle some of these very sensitive issues. Again, we live in a large country with 330 million people of very different political viewpoints. Until 1973, states were making changes to their abortion laws. Some states were liberalizing their laws. Some states weren't. Without Roe v. Wade, once again, states would have the power to take their own course. I suspect California and New York might have more liberal abortion laws than a state like mine in Arkansas or a state like Iowa. That's how our country operated until 1973. I think it can do just fine once again, and in fact, I think that's probably the better course of action on the matter.
Abortion advocates are more than willing to defend abortion, and we've seen multiple times in the past year how they've come out to protect abortion laws, especially during the Kavanaugh hearings. We saw Christine Blasey Ford's lawyer say that Ford accused Kavanaugh partially out of a desire to protect Roe v. Wade. What do you think? How far will they go to protect abortion if Roe is at stake?
Well, I think you saw how far they would go in Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation hearings. You know, the stakes were a little bit lower the year prior with Neil Gorsuch because he was replacing Justice Scalia, but with Brett Kavanaugh replacing Justice Kennedy, who had been a member of the majority in Planned Parenthood v. Casey, the abortion lobby and the abortion industry pulled out all the stops. What happened to Brett Kavanaugh was a disgrace. He was attacked and he was smeared without evidence, in fact, contrary to what little evidence there was. So I think you saw just how far they will go. It's an example of how radical and extreme Democrats have become. You know, Bill Clinton used to say when he was running for president, when he was president, that abortion should be safe, legal, and rare. How many Democrats today would say that abortion should be rare? I mean, they're more likely to defend infanticide like Ralph Northam, the governor of Virginia, once did on air, than they are to say that abortion should be rare.
I mean, we saw Tulsi Gabbard saying what you just said, that the Clintons had said that abortion should be safe, legal, and rare, and yet she received a lot of criticism for that, and Senator Bernie Sanders went so far as to say that abortion is a part of the Democratic platform. Do you see the Democratic platform ever accepting?
I doubt it. I mean, the Democrats, I would say, are not pro-choice. They're pro-abortion. And you saw it in 2020 as well in a somewhat obscure, but I think, you know, informative Democratic primary for Congress in Chicago. Dan Lipinski, a longtime liberal Democrat, but also a pro-life Democrat, finally was defeated in his Democratic primary by a far-left progressive candidate who was endorsed by a who's who of progressives in America, whether it was Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Emily's List, NARAL, and so forth. So there really is no place anymore in the Democratic Party to be pro-life, which is not the case as recently as 20 or 30 years ago. So maybe if they lose enough elections, as they did in the 1980s, which helped bring Bill Clinton into office, they'll start to sing a different tune. But in some cases, I think Democrats have now become so committed to such an ideological worldview, whether it's on something like abortion or attacking the police. I wonder whether they'd rather lose an election than moderate their views just a little.
And one final question for you. We worked with you earlier this year and last year on Planned Parenthood allegedly taking $80 million in coronavirus funding loans that they weren't supposed to receive. Now, we worked with you last year when you called on the Department of Justice to investigate these loans, and you called on the Small Business Administration to investigate these loans, and yet we haven't heard anything yet. What's going on with this?
We're still waiting to hear final word. Let's just say that I don't suspect that the Biden Small Business Administration and the Biden Department of Justice is going to be quite as zealous in upholding the law that was passed by Congress last year, in which Planned Parenthood was not supposed to receive any of this funding, not using any clever workarounds or gimmicks or paper shuffling in the way they and their chapters are formed. But the intent of Congress from the very beginning was that Planned Parenthood, which makes its money and profits off of abortion, should receive emergency funding that was supposed to be going to legitimate businesses to keep their employees on the payroll and to families who are struggling with the uncertainty of this pandemic from the very beginning.
All right. Well, Senator, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.